Clara was engaged solely to prepare meals for 6 young ladies whose mother had passed and their stoic rancher father. Her intention was to remain only until she had earned her keep. However, before the first week concluded, the youngest of the girls addressed her as Mama. Clara did not await an invitation from the man. The instant the downpour ceased, she disembarked from the wagon, her canvas satchel bumping against her knees as her boots met the earth with a resolve that had been absent from her spirit for many years. The middle daughter, Eliza, was the first to observe her, peering from behind a support pillar, a trace of blackberry adorning her chin and eyes that seemed disproportionately large for her delicate countenance. Clara offered a gesture that was half a salute, but Eliza swiftly retreated from view, much like a marmot disappearing into its burrow. The measured tread of a man's boots echoed from behind the pillar as he emerged around the corner of the porch. He was exceptionally tall, even for the hat he wore, and possessed a breadth of build far exceeding any man Clara had encountered in the 2 years since George's passing. She waited for him to initiate conversation, but he merely offered a single nod, his gaze fixed not upon her, but on the bag she had placed at her feet. "My name is Clara Weaver," she stated promptly. "I have been a widow for 2 years this autumn. I cook, I maintain the household. I have no tolerance for impudence or idleness. You mentioned 6 daughters. I have brought an additional supply of flour." His eyes momentarily shifted to her, a fleeting glance, yet something seemed to register. Perhaps recognition, not of her features, but of the essence of the woman she was, worn around the edges, mended numerous times, yet still standing. He extended a hand. "Matthew Langley," he replied, his voice possessing a gruff timbre, like bark stripped from a pine. "The residence is in that direction." He indicated a substantial timber structure situated behind the barn. The porch exhibited a slight sag at its far extremity. "You will be assigned the chamber at the rear beyond the larder. The girls reside in the attic quarters. I often sleep on the porch." Clara posed no inquiries. She simply acknowledged his words with a nod, adjusted her grip on her satchel, and commenced walking. The interior of the house mirrored the weariness of the man and the austerity of the land. A table bore the marks of years of children's elbows, utensils, and instructional slates. A collection of footwear by the door, demonstrably too small for a man, was arranged in a somewhat haphazard line, and the air was tinged with the scent of scorched flour and soured milk. "I shall prepare supper," she announced without preamble. "There is no need," came a sharp retort from the stairs. She would later ascertain this to be Bethany, the eldest. With arms tightly crossed, her expression was one of stubborn defiance, remarkably so for a 10-year-old. "We are not hungry." Clara offered no response. She set her satchel down, rolled up her sleeves, and made her way to the root cellar. By twilight, the comforting aroma of wholesome food permeated the dwelling, a hearty stew, enriched with herbs, bread undergoing its final rise near the warmth of the stone hearth, and wild honey drizzled into cups of tea for the younger ones, who accepted it without request, yet consumed it all the same. No one spoke during the meal. The man occupied the far end of the table, his knife moving through the bread crust with a consistent rhythm. The girls alternated their glances between him and Clara, as if uncertain of the boundaries that had been established. It was as Clara was drying her hands, preparing to clear the dishes, that it occurred a gentle tug at her skirt. She glanced down. Addie, the youngest, stood before her, her eyes blinking upwards, her small fingers clasped around the hem of Clara's apron. Her hair was the colour of butter left out too long, and her voice carried a delicate sound, like wind rustling through shutters. "Are you my mamma now?" she inquired. Her words stilled every utensil, every clink of spoon within the room. Clara's breath hitched in her throat, laden with memories and an overwhelming sadness that rendered her speechless. Her gaze shifted to Matthew, but he averted his eyes. I merely cook and clean, sweetheart," Clara whispered. "Nothing more." Addie, however, simply nodded, as if she had perceived a meaning entirely different, and returned to her seat without further utterance. That night, Clara lay in the small back room, her hands clasped tightly, striving to suppress the recollection of the child she had lost before the infant had even reached her first birthday. The profound silence of the house seemed to creak around her, but from the darkness the floorboard shifted, a faint whisper of footsteps, then a soft rapping at her door. "Mum," it was Eliza once more. Clara drew her shawl more closely and opened the door. The young girl stood there holding a candle cupped in her hands. "I heard a coyote," she murmured. "May I remain here for a short while?" Clara remained silent. She stepped aside, and Eliza climbed onto the small cot without a sound. Later, Clara would awaken to find another child, and then another, nestled against her legs and sides one by one, having navigated the creaking floorboards solely for the comfort of her presence. As the sun began to ascend, Clara's bed was occupied by all 6 of them. The small chamber was filled with the gentle respirations of the 6 girls, a sight that Matthew would inevitably notice. He stood just outside the room near dawn, his arms folded, hat in hand, his expression somber. Clara emerged, rubbing her eyes, attempting to conceal the depth of her sleep, the first truly restful slumber she had experienced in years. "They all came to me," she stated quietly. "I did not invite them." "I am aware," he responded after a brief pause. He did not offer a smile, but his gaze softened subtly. "That is enough." The subsequent days passed with an almost breathless swiftness. Clara made no inquiries regarding the whereabouts of their mother, nor did any of the girls volunteer any information. This remained true even when she discovered a solitary ribbon in a cupboard, still faintly perfumed with lavender and smoke. It was also evident when she observed Bethany, the eldest, seated outdoors, a pair of her mother's old shoes cradled in her lap, meticulously polishing them, despite the fact that they had not fit her since springtime. Grief, however, leaves its indelible marks, and the void left by a mother's absence is immeasurable. Clara made no attempt to fill that void. She simply ensured that sustenance was provided at mealtimes, that every garment bore neat stitches, and that a warm hand was available to soothe fevered brows during the chilling nights. Gradually, a transformation began to occur, one child at a time. Mary, who had spoken only in hushed tones for weeks, started to hum while assisting with the kneading of dough. Lahi, the second youngest, no longer cried when the wind rattled the windows during the night. Even Bethany ceased her sharp glances, and one afternoon, as Clara passed the pantry, she overheard the girl softly remark to herself, "She doesn't even smell like ashes." Whatever this cryptic comment signified, it settled within Clara's heart with a profound stillness. The true turning point arrived with the matter of the fence. A fierce storm swept through, tearing down nearly half of the barrier posts. Matthew and the eldest son from the adjacent ranch commenced repairs at first light. Clara brought out a tray of biscuits and found him standing there, his shoulders slumped, his palms bleeding from handling the rope. "Allow me," she declared, taking the hammer before he could protest. He did not hinder her. They toiled in silence until the sky began to darken once more. The final nail was driven home just as the first drops of rain began to fall, and at that precise moment it happened. From the house, Addie's voice, small and piercing, carried on the wind. "You fixed our fence. Could you fix Mama's heart too?" The hammer slipped from Clara's grasp. Matthew froze, and the rain began to fall in earnest. Matthew did not turn. The hammer lay abandoned in the dirt near his boots, and Clara stood motionless, her palms still damp from both her labor and the rain. She held her breath, as if even exhaling might shatter the fragile moment. The instant Addie's voice faded as quickly as it had arrived, carried away by the rising wind, it resonated between them like the toll of a bell in a hushed sanctuary. Clara stooped, retrieved the hammer, and offered it back to him. He did not accept it. "I will start supper," she said gently. Matthew finally met her gaze. his eyes guarded yet devoid of harshness. "I will finish here," he replied after a moment. The walk back to the house felt considerably longer than it had on her arrival. The sky opened up completely before she reached the porch, and by the time she stepped inside, she was thoroughly drenched. The girls immediately surrounded her, offering towels, guiding her towards the hearth, each one speaking over the others. It was only after she had dried her hair and placed the kettle back on the stove that she realized they had instinctively formed a protective circle around her. One girl was perched on the armrest of a chair, another reclined on the rug, two more settled against her knees. Bethany stood in the doorway, her arms once again crossed, but her voice had lost its customary sharpness. "You didn't even flinch when she said that." "I heard," Clara replied softly. "She says things like that sometimes," Bethany continued. "Mama, things. It hurts." Clara nodded. "Yes, it does." "Are you going to stay?" The question was not delivered with any trace of acrimony, nor was it challenging. It was simply weary, carrying a weight far beyond her 10 years. Clara's response came after a silence that enveloped the room like a comforting embrace. "I have no plans to depart." Bethany glanced at her sisters, then back at Clara. "Good," she said. "We are tired of women who leave." The door creaked softly as Matthew entered. Water streamed from his coat. His eyes swept across the room, and for the first time since Clara's arrival, his shoulders appeared less burdened. "The storm is not over," he stated, "but the fence will hold." Clara rose from the chair and moved towards the stove. "Supper in 10 minutes," he acknowledged with a nod, brushed the water from his sleeves, and disappeared into his room. That night, the storm intensified its fury. The wind shrieked down the chimney, and thunder cracked with the sound of a tree splitting directly in half. Leahy cried out from her loft bed, and Clara was already ascending the ladder before Matthew's feet had even touched the floorboards. "It's all right," she soothed, gathering the little girl into her embrace. "It's merely noise, just the sky stamping its boots." "Is it angry?" Leahy whimpered. "Is the sky angry again?" "No, sweetheart, it's just loud. Loud doesn't mean it's angry." The other girls began to stir, and Clara lay down across the floorboards of the loft, allowing the children to gather around her like kittens seeking the warmth of a stove. One by one, their breathing grew slower, the storm eventually receded, and a sense of peace returned to the wooden structure. Matthew did not return to his room. She heard his footsteps pause, then retreat towards the porch. She did not follow. She, too, did not sleep. 3 days elapsed before he engaged her in conversation of any significant depth. They were in the barn, tending to a goat that had sustained a gash on its flank. Clara stilled the animals as Matthew worked, his touch surprisingly tender, given his history of splitting logs through entire winters without protective coverings. "Have you spent much time with creatures before?" he inquired softly. "I was raised on a farm." "Then you understand how they become skittish when something feels amiss." Clara nodded, her thoughts turning to the girls, who mirrored this sensitivity. After their mother's passing, they had remained utterly silent for almost 2 weeks. Subsequently, their behavior shifted dramatically, becoming as unruly as young colts startled beyond measure. "I was at a loss, and still am. You ensured they were fed. You remained present. My remaining here stems from an inability to conceive of doing anything else. That is more than many would offer." He secured the final stitch and stood. "That youngest one, the one who addressed you as Mama on the very first day. She is scarcely 5 years of age. She was with her mother at the moment of her death." Clara's heart ached. She had been found nestled beside her mother in bed. It took me hours to persuade her to release her grip. They stood in quiet contemplation for a period. The wind outside the barn had subsided, and the goats had settled contentedly within their enclosures. Matthew cast a glance toward the house. "I'm unsure of your methods," he stated. "However, whatever you are doing, they are now sleeping through the entire night." "I'm not implementing any specific actions," Clara responded, "simply being present." Perhaps then, that was their sole requirement all along. On Sunday, They journeyed the 4 miles on foot to the church situated on the ridge. Clara prepared a parcel containing biscuits and dried peaches. The girls were dressed in dresses that didn't quite match, their hair secured in various states of disarray. Matthew followed behind, his hat pulled low, his stride even. Clara had not entered a church since the funeral service. Her knees nearly gave way upon entering, but she compelled herself to move forward. The girls settled into the pew with practiced grace. Clara took a seat beside them, with Matthew joining at the edge, as if poised for immediate departure. The pastor was a slender gentleman with kind eyes, who acknowledged the new arrivals without drawing undue attention. The sermon focused on the theme of restoration, exploring how fractured items could be repaired, not to be made entirely new, but strengthened in the very places where they had sustained damage. Clara felt a constriction in her throat midway through the discourse. Upon glancing over, she observed Bethany had intertwined her hand with Addie's. Following the service, the girls raced outdoors, reveling in chasing one another beneath the sun. Matthew remained near the entrance while Clara stood beside him, the sun's warmth a mere fraction of the contentment filling her. "Did you frequent this place?" he inquired. "With my husband before he passed." "He was a man of faith." "No," she replied, a faint smile gracing her lips. "But he appreciated the singing." Matthew offered no smile, yet the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "I can certainly appreciate that sentiment." They stood in silence once more until Addie came bounding toward them, her hair dishevelled and her chin smudged with dirt. "I've discovered a feather," she exclaimed, presenting it as a prized possession. "A genuine feather from a dove." Clara crouched down. "Then you must safeguard it carefully." "It's intended for you," she declared, pressing it into Clara's palm, "to preserve the tenderness of your heart." Clara's eyes widened. "Who imparted that knowledge to you?" My heart felt quite hardened. Addie offered a shrug. "No one. I simply perceive it as somewhat sorrowful, yet improved now." Matthew observed Clara as she carefully placed the feather within her prayer book, then met her gaze with an understanding that transcended words. Their walk homeward was at a more leisurely pace than their outward journey. 2 days later, Clara found Bethany outdoors with a tattered doll, meticulously reattaching its head using thread pilfered from the pantry. She remained silent as Clara sat beside her. "Her designation is Juniper," Bethany murmured. "Mother crafted her prior to falling ill. She is quite lovely. She has been without her head since the very night Mother passed." Clara gently rested her hand upon the girls' heads. "Some matters require time to mend," she stated. Bethy's lower lip quivered. "And if they do not mend, then we must embrace the remnants." The subsequent morning, 2 biscuits, shaped like hearts, appeared on Clara's windowsill. They were imperfectly formed, with scorched edges, yet possessed a unique perfection. The atmosphere within the house began to transform. This was not a sudden alteration, marked by grand pronouncements or rearranged furnishings, nor a ceremonial turning of a new leaf. It commenced with subtle shifts, such as Bethany ceasing to retreat to the woodshed after her household duties, and Rosie resuming her humming while setting the table. Addie, once the most spirited among them, now routinely checked the windows for Clara when twilight descended, perpetually awaiting her return from the well, and Clara, though maintaining a degree of caution, also underwent a subtle realignment. She no longer sought permission before baking 2 loaves of bread instead of 1. She did not gauge Matthew's approval when she scrubbed the floorboards on her hands and knees using soap crafted from lavender and pine resin. She began folding the girls' dresses without being prompted and started writing their names from memory onto small fabric tags to preempt any disputes over ownership. And Matthew, he remained largely reserved, but his silence had lost its previous chill. He started leaving his tools within her reach, no longer secured in the barn. He repaired the awkwardly angled step that had caused her to stub her toe without any prior mention from her. One morning, Without direct eye contact, he poured her coffee first and presented it without a sound. It was stronger than she preferred, but she consumed it nonetheless. He took notice. The following morning it was weaker, and though he offered no commentary, he presented it to her again. This small act of consideration was akin to a passage in a narrative that both had forgotten how to read. It was 2 weeks after that Sunday service that Clara began to perceive the true extent of the changes. Addie had taken to trailing her blanket behind her like a young canine, invariably ending up nestled against Clara's side before the morning meal. Rosie, the second youngest, had begun to echo Clara's pronouncements. "Mind your feet, dear, and that's sufficient jam for now." And elbows off the table. Bethany, still the most tempestuous of the 6, now sat closer during meals and had taken it upon herself to braid her sister's hair, quietly instructing them to present a neat appearance for Miss Clara, despite feigning indifference when Clara observed her. One afternoon, as Clara was working with flour dusting her hair and her sleeves rolled high, she noticed the eldest girl, Hannah, observing her through the kitchen doorway. "Are you quite well, sugar?" Clara inquired without ceasing her work. Hannah hesitated before stepping into the kitchen. She looked down at her hands, twisting a hem into knots. "I wish to learn the process of kneading, to prepare bread as Mother used to." Clara's hands became motionless. "Are you certain?" The girl nodded, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson. "I have been inhaling the aroma each morning, and I simply wish to recall the sensation." Clara pushed the extra portion of dough toward her. "Then let us endeavor to get your hands coated in flour." And so they did. Flour scattered on the floor. Half a bowl's worth of dough was wasted, and flour found its way beneath their fingernails. However, Hannah remained by Clara's side throughout the entire process. Later that evening, when Matthew entered and detected the aroma of the bread, he paused in the doorway and regarded his eldest daughter with an expression that suggested pride, an emotion that was almost painful to witness. "Did you impart that skill to her?" he asked Clara. "She already possessed the knowledge," Clara responded. "She merely needed a reminder." Later that week, Clara stayed up late, engaged in sewing by the lamplight. The girls' dresses were beginning to fray at the hems, and she had quietly undertaken the task of mending them during her own leisure time. 1, then 2, then 3 in succession, she patched and hemmed. By the 4th, her back ached, and the fire had dwindled. A shadow flickered behind her. She turned, startled. Matthew stood there in the dimness, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "I did not intend to startle you," he stated. "You did not. I was simply taken by surprise." He moved closer, just enough for the light to illuminate his face. "You are under no obligation to perform this task. I am aware you are not compensated for mending. I am also cognizant of that fact. Your contributions extend beyond mere culinary duties." Clara carefully set down her needle. "They required more than sustenance." He nodded, but the silence that settled between them grew more profound. Finally he spoke. "My late wife, Elena, she also engaged in such activities in the low light until her eyes ached. I would urge her to desist, and she would smile as if I possessed no understanding whatsoever." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "Perhaps you did not. Perhaps not." He turned to depart, then paused. "She would have been fond of you." Clara looked down at her sewing, her heart pounding. "Thank you," she whispered, but he had already gone. The girls began to address her as Mama when they forgot themselves. Initially, these were unintentional slips of the tongue during the morning's haste. "Mama, I mean, Miss Clara, may I have more?" Or, "Mama, Rosie took my—" "Oh, I apologize." Each utterance caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Each time, Clara would pause, meet their gaze, and remain silent, offering only a small smile or a gentle nod. But they persisted, and she ceased correcting them. Matthew never commented on this, never displayed displeasure, nor averted his gaze. However, on one occasion after dinner, when Addie declared it loudly, "Mamma, I cannot have a second roll." Clara blushed and hesitated, but Matthew merely looked at Addie and said, "Then perhaps you should ask politely, little dove." The following day, he resumed chopping wood, performing double the amount necessary. No one inquired as to the reason. The initial challenge presented itself in the form of a knock. A man stood on the porch one dusty Tuesday, tall and gaunt, with an overly relaxed smirk and a gaze that lacked propriety. He tipped his hat in Clara's direction, but his appraisal of her lingered. When Matthew emerged behind her, silent and broad-shouldered, the man chuckled nervously. "No offense intended," he said, "just passing through. I heard there was a widow providing meals for a household of girls and a solitary man. I thought perhaps I might offer my assistance should the lady require it." Matthew stepped onto the porch without a word, moving with the unhurried pace of molasses, but with significantly more force. "Times are perilous. You have received incorrect information," he stated. "She is not a widow providing meals, she is family." The man raised both hands, retreating as if dispersing like smoke and wind, and did not venture near again. Clara offered no reply. However, that evening, as she brought him his supper, she lingered for a moment longer and gently placed a folded napkin beside his plate. He did not look up, but he murmured a thank you so softly that she almost believed she had imagined it. Then came the second trial. Sickness. Little Rosie awoke shivering in the night, her skin flushed and her breathing labored. Clara was at her side before the second cough. A common cold, they surmised, merely a cold, but as dawn approached, the coughing grew worse, her breaths became ragged gasps, and her lips lost all color. Clara commanded with the authority of someone born to endure hardship. "Boil water, gather willow bark, keep the others back." Bethany watched, pale-faced, as Clara undressed the ailing girl, applied cool compresses to her feverish skin, and supported her so the labored breathing wouldn't overwhelm her. Matthew rode into town in a rage, returning before sunset with the physician and a considerable quantity of medicine. He paced like a man unhinged outside the room, while the younger children sobbed in the corners. Clara remained on the bedside, holding Rosie, murmuring prayers between applications of cool cloths and soothing the child's shivers. "She's strong," Clara reassured them. "She's going to pull through." And Rosie did. It took 4 days, but the fever finally subsided. When Rosie eventually opened her eyes and asked for a simple biscuit, Clara wept into the bed linens, making no effort to hide her relief. That night, the girls clustered around her, clinging like ivy to a sturdy tree, and it was on that very night that Matthew first uttered the word aloud. "Mama," he said, standing in the doorway. "She just called you Mama." Clara nodded. She did. Matthew looked at her then, truly looked at her, the exhaustion and sadness on his face slowly softening into something tender. "Are you all right with that?" Clara blinked back tears. More than all right. He then quietly left the doorway. By morning, however, a small posy of wildflowers, freshly gathered and tied with twine, appeared on the kitchen table. No one admitted to placing them there. The world after Rosie's ordeal felt different, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but as if the very walls of the house now exhaled more easily, and laughter returned without needing to be coaxed. Even the rooster's morning crow sounded less like a declaration of war, and more like a gentle hymn. Clara began to sing again. She hadn't even realized she had stopped, but the morning after Rosie took her first hesitant steps from bed, Clara found herself humming a simple melody her own mother used to sing while peeling potatoes. Soon Addie, from her spot on the floorboards, picked up the tune, twirling in slow circles in the doorway. Bethany, hands on her hips, whispered, "She's never danced before." Clara, smiling at the bubbling pot on the stove, whispered back, "Perhaps it just wasn't the right song." Hannah sat straighter at the table these days, and the book she once ignored now remained open for longer periods. Clara taught her to meticulously write recipes and practice neat penmanship, and the two older girls began taking turns reading passages from the Bible aloud before sleep, an effort Matthew had made since his wife's passing, but which had always dissolved into awkward silences and stifled sobs. Now the household prayed together, and Clara wasn't just facilitating the prayers, she was being prayed for. Matthew first spoke her name aloud during grace one evening. The stew was still steaming, and all 6 girls sat with their hands clasped. As Matthew bowed his head, he spoke softly. "Thank you, Lord, for this meal, and for the hands that prepared it, for Clara, who brings brightness to this table and stabilizes what was so close to breaking." None of the girls looked up, but Clara's heart soared. That night, after the house had settled and her lamp cast a dim glow, she knelt beside her cot and wept, not from sadness, nor entirely from joy, but from the release of a tension held within her for years. She had come to cook, but the Lord had placed her at the heart of a family yearning for wholeness. A letter arrived 3 weeks later, its seal smudged from a hurried postmark. Clara discovered it resting on the porch railing before breakfast and recognized it even before reading the name. The handwriting was too precise, the ink too fresh. It was from Raymond, her late husband's brother, the one who had written only once since the funeral, the one who had offered no assistance with the debts, the burial, the provisions, or the pervasive silence that followed her every breath as a widow. The letter stated he was relocating to the West. It mentioned he had heard she was working for a widower with 6 children. It suggested perhaps it was time they reconnected, that they could start anew. He signed it with the same familiar name, Ray, devoid of affection, apology, or any acknowledgement of the 7 years she had spent grieving with no one to share her burden. She folded the letter slowly and quietly, tucking it into the pocket of her apron. She didn't mention it to Matthew, not that day, nor the next, but it sat like a stone within her apron, growing heavier each time she laid it aside at night. It was Hannah who first brought it up. She had been reading on the porch with Bethany, their shoulders touching, when Clara emerged to shake out the rugs. A gentle breeze caught the edge of the letter in her pocket, and Hannah's keen eyes noticed the corner of a name. "Is that for you?" she inquired. Clara paused. "It is from family." "No," Clara replied after a moment. "Not any more." Bethany remained silent, but Hannah pressed on. "Are you going to answer it?" Clara avoided their gaze. "I don't know." Hannah said nothing further, but Clara felt the weight of her scrutiny even after she returned to her book. It wasn't the letter itself that altered things, but the silence Clara chose to surround it with. Matthew noticed, of course. He had spent the past month observing her every movement, like someone deciphering sacred texts for the first time in years. So, when her laughter grew softer and her gait a little slower, he inquired. He didn't press, but waited until the children were asleep, until the porch lamp flickered low, and then said, "You seem distant." Clara, seated opposite him with a quilt draped over her lap, didn't fabricate a response. There was a letter from someone who only now decided to make contact. He nodded. "Someone you knew well. Someone I once believed would have laid me to rest beside my husband. Now he writes as if I were a stranger who moved away." Matthew stirred the dregs of his coffee. "Are you planning to visit him?" "I don't know. You would tell me if you were." "I am telling you now." A moment of silence followed. Then he said softly, "You have already built something here. The girls adore you." Clara gazed out towards the darkened fields, where fireflies pulsed like lost lanterns in the fog. "I didn't come here seeking love." "And I didn't hire you for it," Matthew replied. "But it is here nonetheless." Clara's breath hitched. "You believe I would leave? I don't wish to contemplate it at all." And as their eyes met in the stillness of that quiet porch, the space between them felt as delicate as parchment and 10 times more fragile. The storm arrived that Saturday. The wind descended from the hills as if intent on ravaging the trees themselves. The youngest girls shrieked when the barn doors burst open, scattering hay across the yard like festive streamers. Matthew dashed out into the downpour with a rope and Clara, despite his shouts, followed. Together, drenched, they clutched the barn's frame. Against the furious roar of the sky, they secured the door with a knot she had learned during her marriage. They spoke no words until the rain subsided, until they stood panting, soaked to the bone, mud clinging to their knees. Clara looked up at him, her hair plastered to her face, and managed through a gasp, "Perhaps next time I'll let you handle the running." Matthew shook the water from his beard, then met her eyes. "Next time," he began, but his hand reached out, trembling slightly, and touched her cheek, gently pushing back a stray strand of hair with a tenderness that utterly disarmed her. "Stay," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Just stay." She stepped closer, her own body trembling, and rested her forehead against his chest. The tempest outside had passed, but a new one had erupted within her heart. The letter remained unacknowledged. Weeks drifted by. She sent no reply. Raymond could find another recipient for his name. She already had 6 souls whispering "Mama" in their sleep. 6 pairs of arms enfolding her waist for comfort. 6 small hearts constructing a home around her presence. She also had Matthew, though neither had yet voiced it. It didn't need to be spoken. One morning, Clara awoke to find a thoughtful arrangement beside the stove. A stack of paper, ink, and a wooden box with a brass clasp. Within the box lay a hand-carved spoon, its handle inscribed with her name. Below the name, etched so finely it required the right light to discern, was one more word: family. With eyes stinging, she silently brought the box to the table and placed it before the girls. Addie peered at it, giggling. "Mama, that's your name." Rosie clapped her hands. "It's your spoon. Your very own spoon." Clara touched the smooth wood and whispered, "It's more than that." Bethany met her gaze and declared, as clear as the sun, "It's yours because you're ours." Matthew entered then, his boots still dusted from the morning's chores. He offered no words, merely a soft, genuine smile and a tip of his hat. The day Clara began fashioning dresses from remnants of flour sacks, Matthew observed her from the doorway of the washroom, as if the mere sight might bring him to tears. She had gathered the girls around her in a loose semicircle on the rug, each child holding a scrap of fabric and a needle, which Clara had patiently shown them how to thread. Rosie, too young for intricate work, mostly tangled herself in string, but Clara allowed her to participate, cooing with delight each time the child made a wayward loop. Bethany, ever the meticulous one, was already replicating Clara's stitches with the focused precision of a woman twice her age. "You're creating something from nothing," Matthew remarked later, assisting with the firewood. Clara chuckled softly, avoiding his eyes. "That's what mothers do." He paused then, allowing the full significance of her words to settle in the air between them. Clara hadn't intended to say it, not in that way. It had simply emerged, honest and unguarded, much like everything else had been emerging from her more and more around Matthew these days. And instead of recoiling, Matthew stepped closer. "You are one," he stated, as if proclaiming a truth he had long since accepted. Clara, blinking, tried to feign indifference, but felt every fibre of her being tighten at the sound of his confession. A week later, Addie tumbled from the rope swing. It was a rather unpleasant descent. Clara heard the cry just before she saw the others dashing across the expanse of the lawn, their arms flailing, their feet stumbling through the grass. Addie lay awkwardly at the base of the oak, her arm cradled, sobs escaping in ragged breaths that made Clara's own chest constrict. She dropped to her knees beside the child and gathered her into her lap. Matthew was already sprinting towards the wagon. They reached the doctor's practice in just under an hour. The journey was bumpy, the wagon wheels jolting over every stone. Clara held Addie throughout the entire trip, murmuring reassurances and simple melodies between the girl's quiet whimpers. The doctor confirmed her arm was fractured, but it was a clean break with no complications. He advised Matthew that she would need to be careful with it and avoid any rope swings for the foreseeable future. Clara nodded, gently brushing Addie's damp hair from her forehead. "I'll make sure," she promised, and when Addie tearfully whispered, "I want Mama," it didn't even cross anyone's mind, not the doctor's, not Matthew's, not even Addie's, that she wasn't referring to someone else entirely. The house seemed to settle once more, subtly but with growing certainty. Addie began to call Clara Mama whenever she needed anything, a glass of milk, a comforting embrace, or a gentle tuck into bed at night. Rosie, observing this new pattern, soon followed suit, and before long, the youngest voices in the house were constantly calling, "Mama, Mama, Mama," as if they had never known any other maternal figure. Clara should have corrected them, but she found she couldn't. Bethany, ever the most observant, didn't voice her thoughts openly at first. However, one evening after their meal, she presented Clara with a folded piece of paper. It bore a drawing of 6 stick figures holding hands, with a larger figure positioned in the center. At the top, in wobbly letters, it read, "Me and my sisters with our mama." Clara's thumb traced the familiar letters, and she then kissed the top of Bethy's head, offering silent affection. Then came the Sunday. Matthew stood beside Clara in church. They had attended services before, always with the girls, but this time he didn't take his usual seat at the end of the pew. He sat directly beside her, so close that his elbow brushed hers with every turn of a page in the hymnal. As the preacher spoke of the Lord mending what had been broken, Clara felt Matthew's breath hitch beside her. Afterward, while the girls were playfully chasing each other around their wagon, a neighbor woman approached. "I heard you took on a housekeeper," she remarked to Matthew, her smile a little too saccharine, her eyes appraising Clara from head to toe. "I didn't," he replied. Clara blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. The neighbor woman's smile faltered. Matthew then turned to Clara, his hand briefly resting on the small of her back. "I took in a mother." The neighbor's smile vanished completely. Matthew, however, seemed not to notice, or perhaps didn't care. He guided Clara towards the wagon as if nothing significant had transpired between them, but her heart was beating so wildly within her chest that she remained silent for the entire journey home, afraid that speaking might shatter the fragile happiness that had just begun to take root. There was only one person left whose affirmation was still needed: Hannah. She had been observing the others for weeks, quiet yet perceptive, always lingering on the periphery of their activities. Clara understood that the girl was guarding her emotions, anticipating another departure. Clara didn't press. She waited until a night when a powerful thunderstorm cracked through the sky like a lash, sending all the younger girls scrambling into a single bed for comfort. Clara moved from room to room, tucking them in, singing softly over Rosie's wide eyes and smoothing Addie's curls where she clutched her sling as if it were a protective shield. Hannah's room was last. The girl sat upright, arms crossed, her jaw set. "The storm won't hurt you," Clara said gently. Hannah didn't meet her gaze. "Storms always take something away," she murmured. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. "What did the last one take?" "My mama," Hannah whispered, her voice breaking. "The fever came during a storm. I've always wondered if things might have been different, if the weather had been different." Clara reached for her hand, holding it firmly. "I can't replace her," she said softly, "but I can stay." Hannah finally looked at her, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. "Even if I don't call you Mama," she said. Clara nodded. Even then, Hannah's lip trembled. "But I think I want to," she whispered. Clara drew her close, holding her tightly through the thunder, the rain, and the long, quiet aftermath. Spring arrived gradually, like a slow, unfolding bloom. The frost retreated, the creek thawed, and Clara's hands returned to the soil, planting basil, carrots, peas, and nascent hope. The girls took turns assisting, each more dedicated than the last. Matthew dug 2 new raised garden beds behind the barn and remarked, "Thought we might need more space this year." Clara smiled at him. "Expecting a second harvest?" "I'm expecting this family to remain whole," he stated, his gaze steady. Her knees felt weak, and she steadied herself against the hoe. That night, he didn't sleep. He waited until the moon was high in the sky and the last lantern had been extinguished, and then he stood outside her door. He didn't knock, simply breathed in long and slow and whispered, "Clara." She opened the door, already dressed, her hair in a braid, her hands clasped. "I thought perhaps you might come." He glanced down at her hands, then back to her face. "There's something I need to say." She nodded. "I lost my wife, but I didn't lose my heart. Nor did I. I believed love ended with death." "So did I," he confessed. He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I was mistaken." Clara's breath hitched. Matthew extended his hand, offering a ring. It wasn't new, but old and worn, likely his mother's. It wasn't meant to replace anyone, but to signify a choice. Clara gazed at it, then at him, and finally whispered, "Yes." He placed it on her finger, as if it had always belonged there. The following morning, 6 young girls awoke to the sound of Clara's laughter, bright and buoyant, filling the house like shafts of sunlight. When they rushed into the kitchen, tumbling and squealing, Rosie was the first to spot the ring. Her joyful cry was so loud it startled the chickens. Bethany simply smiled. "You're truly our mamma now," she declared. Clara gathered them all into her arms. "I always was." The wedding was simple, almost spontaneous, and suited them far better than any grand celebration could have. Matthew and Clara stood beneath the blossoming crab apple tree behind their home, its white petals falling like a soft benediction. The girls wore matching blue dresses that Clara had fashioned from old curtains and remnants of cotton. The minister was the same gentleman who had baptized Rosie the previous year, and he brought his wife along to play a gentle melody on the fiddle during the vows. No guests were present other than the 6 girls. No others were needed. Hannah presented the ring. After a moment of solemnity where she nearly dropped it, Rosie began tucking flowers into Matthew's vest pocket as if it were a game. Bethany cried so profusely that Clara had to hold her hand throughout the entire ceremony. Matthew then kissed each girl on the forehead before finally turning to Clara, his hands steady, his eyes clearer than she had ever seen them. "I promise," he said, "to keep this house stable and you always safe." Clara made no effort to hold back her tears. "And I promise to love these girls as my own. And you," she added, "as if I had been waiting my entire life." And perhaps she had. Their first kiss was brief and tender, but the girls' delighted shrieks echoed loud enough to wake the surrounding hills. By sundown, the newly formed family sat together at the table, sharing stew, cornbread, and raspberry pie, as if it were Christmas Day. Yet even in joy, life does not stand still. Just 2 days after the wedding, a firm, business-like knock sounded at the door. Matthew opened it, with Clara standing closely behind him. Sheriff Denham stood there, hat in hand, his expression grave. "Sorry to disturb your new beginning, Matthew, but you've been named in a property dispute." Matthew frowned. "Over what?" Denham hesitated. "Your late wife's cousin, Martin. He's asserting that your land's deed was registered improperly. He claims your wife inherited it, not you. Now he's stating it should have passed to her relatives, not her husband." Matthew froze. "That land has been mine since I was 17. He possessed some documents and had retained legal counsel from back east." The girls had gathered in the doorway, listening intently. Clara moved swiftly, ushering them away, but Hannah remained. "They're not going to take our home," she stated, her voice flat. Clara didn't respond. "Not yet." The following weeks brought a disruption to their newfound peace. They had only just begun to weave their lives together. Matthew travelled back and forth to town, consulting with a legal associate, gathering deeds, affidavits, and testimonies. The girls noticed his absences. Clara did her best to fill the void, as she always did, but a palpable tension now permeated the house, a fear she could sense in the hushed whispers the girls shared under their quilts late at night. She had grown to cherish the sound of their giggles echoing through the wooden floors. Now those sounds were quieter, tinged with a growing anxiety. And through it all, Clara wrestled with the insidious thought that whispered, "If they take the land, where will we go?" Then, one evening, while tidying a drawer in search of birth certificates, anything that might strengthen their claim, Matthew discovered something else, something long forgotten, a letter, unopened. He brought it to Clara in the kitchen. "It's from Ruth," he said, his voice rough, "from about a year before she passed." Clara took it gently, opened the envelope, and read aloud. "Dearest Matthew, if you are reading this, I have likely gone. I have tried not to burden you with my anxieties, but I wish for everything to be in order. That land, your land, was always rightfully yours. I understand its significance to you. I never wished for anyone else to lay claim to it. Therefore, I am signing this to formalize my wishes. I do not trust my cousin Martin. I always had a premonition that he would come sniffing around. I want you to have peace, for the girls to grow up in the place that is rightfully theirs. And perhaps one day you will not be alone in that place. I hope someone good finds you, someone kind, someone who recognizes the man you truly are. With love, Ruth." The letter was dated, signed, and witnessed by a neighbor woman from the valley. Clara clutched it to her chest. "This," she breathed, "this saves everything." The lawyer confirmed its validity. The document would hold up in court. The challenge dissolved within days, and Martin departed the town, muttering threats that no one paid any heed to. The house remained theirs. The fields remained theirs. The creek, the garden, their shared future. Everything felt anchored once more, as solid as bedrock after a tempest had passed. That evening Clara knelt by her bed, her 6 daughters already slumbering, and offered a prayer not of entreaty but of gratitude for their haven, for the affection they shared, for a new beginning. Yet something had shifted within Clara. Her victory had come at a profound cost. Witnessing how swiftly all they cherished could be imperiled, snatched away, had awakened a deep resolve within her. She began meticulously recording every cent spent, every jar of preserves sold, every egg exchanged in a small ledger tucked into the back of her recipe book. Matthew naturally took notice. "Do you believe we'll need to face another conflict?" he inquired one night, resting against the porch railing. "I prefer to be prepared," she replied. Matthew offered no argument. He simply took her hand and declared, "Then I shall construct a more substantial pantry for you." A smile touched her lips. However, 2 days later, he fulfilled his promise, constructing a new pantry and also building additional chicken coops. Clara found solace in drying fragrant herbs by the window, and each of the girls diligently planted her own small plot of flowers. It was no longer merely about enduring, it was about forging a lasting legacy. Then, one morning, a letter arrived, its address inscribed to Clara. She opened it with deliberate slowness, recognizing the familiar script from a period she had long considered buried. It bore the signature of Samuel's sister, her late husband's sole surviving relative. The correspondence was concise. Samuel had passed away. It transpired that this had occurred years ago, not long after he had deserted her. Yet within the carefully penned lines, a single sentence resonated, occupying her thoughts for days on end. "He never ceased to regret his actions toward you. I believed you ought to be informed." She shared no word of the letter with the girls, at least not initially. That night, however, she presented it to Matthew. He read it silently, then returned it to her. "Are you all right?" he inquired. "I am more than all right," she affirmed. "I simply hadn't anticipated such a gentle closing of that chapter." Matthew gave a knowing nod. "You deserve gentle closings." They retired early that night, and for the first time in a vast expanse of time, Clara's dreams were not haunted by what she had lost, but illuminated by what she had discovered. Then illness swept through. Rosie was the first, manifesting a cough, a fever, her cheeks flushed with a heat that resisted the cooling touch of cloth steeped in mint tea or vinegar. Soon after, Addie succumbed, followed by Bethany. Clara endured sleepless nights, moving from one room to another, watching over their beds, coaxing sips of broth between lips that barely moved. Matthew summoned the physician on 2 separate occasions. On the second visit, the doctor drew Clara aside, confiding, "This malady, this fever, it's pervasive throughout the entire valley. You are doing everything correctly, but its outcome now rests in divine hands." Clara inclined her head. Tears did not fall. She returned inside, gently bathed their foreheads, and softly hummed a hymn her mother used to sing over her during bouts of measles. By the 3rd day, Bethany stirred and requested water. Clara poured her a full cup and bestowed a kiss upon her brow. Addie followed suit the subsequent morning. Little Rosie, the youngest, endured the longest struggle. However, on the 6th night, her fever finally broke. She opened her eyes and whispered, "Mama." Clara choked back a sob. "I am here." From that point onward, a tranquility settled over the house once more. It was not a silence born of emptiness, but a quietude where every inhaled breath felt like a precious gift. Hannah, ever the keen observer, depicted their entire family beneath a grand tree the following week. She meticulously added halos to her ailing sisters and crowned Clara with a diadem of sunflowers. "She is our queen," Rosie declared, her hands animatedly clapping. "No," Bethany corrected thoughtfully, "she is the very roots." Matthew proudly displayed the drawing above the hearth. "It's not perfect," Hannah murmured apologetically. "No," he responded, his voice gentle. "It's more than perfect. It's ours." And it truly was. Spring gracefully transitioned into summer, much like a beloved hymn resolving into its final tender notes. The days grew long and balmy, and the house that had once resonated with sorrow now vibrated with the lively sounds of daily existence, the patter of bare feet on wooden floors, delighted shrieks echoing from the fields, and soft calls for supper as the twilight sky blushed with colour. One morning, as Clara stood at the sink, finishing the last of the breakfast dishes, Rosie tugged at her dress, her voice imbued with the guileless curiosity only a 5-year-old possesses. "Were you always ours, Mama?" Clara paused, her hands motionless in the dishwater. "No, my sweet girl, not always." Rosie's brow furrowed, as if this revelation was utterly unfathomable. "But I always longed for you," Clara reassured her, "and I believe God intended for things to conclude this way." This explanation seemed to satisfy Rosie, for she broke into a wide grin and dashed back outside, her arms outstretched as if she might take flight. It had been nearly a full year since Clara's arrival, a year since she had crossed the threshold, offering her hands to a man with weary eyes and 6 little girls with hearts yearning for affection. She no longer donned the sombre attire of mourning. Her name spoken no longer caused her to flinch, nor did she retreat into shadowed corners as if merely a guest. No one referred to her as the cook any longer, not even Matthew, especially not Matthew. He addressed her as Clara and sometimes "my wife," and when the girls weren't observing, he would lightly touch the small of her back as if still astonished by her very presence. Their marriage, though understated in its ceremony, had grown richer with each passing season. Theirs was not a romance forged in dramatic pronouncements and dazzling displays, but one quietly constructed in the gentle hours, amidst spilled milk and midnight fevers, mismatched socks and mended fences, shared griefs and laughter exchanged as readily as currency. Yet it was not without its imperfections. Nothing truly alive ever is. There were days when sorrow rendered Matthew taciturn, and nights when Clara sat awake, her mind troubled by finances or a sudden cough emanating from a child's room. However, love had settled into their home like a fine layer of dust upon a windowsill, ever present, often unnoticed, until a shaft of sunlight illuminated it just so. One afternoon, while Matthew was engaged in repairing the barn roof, and the girls were downstream at the creek, capturing frogs, Clara sat on the porch, a letter resting in her lap. It was from her sister Ruth, who resided in Chicago. The letter conveyed warm tidings and a wealth of news. Ruth had remarried. Her sons had grown into adulthood. She extended an invitation for Clara to visit. Clara read the letter twice, then a third time. She carefully folded it and tucked it into her apron pocket. The prospect of leaving, even for a mere week, felt insurmountable. Yet equally daunting was the notion of never returning, of never again traversing the city streets of her former life, of never bidding farewell to the version of herself she had left behind. That evening she confided in Matthew. He did not falter. He did not implore her to stay. He simply said, "We will miss you terribly." "I haven't committed yet," Clara replied, "but I suspect you will." "It's possible," he nodded. "Then I shall enlist the girls to paint a picture for you to carry with you." A chuckle escaped her, though her chest felt tight. 2 weeks later, Clara boarded a train bound westward, planning a visit of only a week. The girls wept at the station, and Matthew clutched Rosie as if she were a fragile bird susceptible to the wind. Clara kissed each daughter's forehead, squeezed Matthew's hand, and stepped onto the train, armed with a courage she couldn't fully articulate. The journey was lengthy and arduous, and the city felt far more boisterous than her recollection. Ruth's residence exuded the scent of polished wood and lilacs, and her sons, tall and kind gentlemen, treated Clara with utmost deference. They inquired about the farm, the girls, the chickens, particularly the chickens for reasons unknown, and earnestly requested the cornbread they remembered from childhood visits. She obliged, yet her heart felt distant. On the third night, Clara strolled through the neighborhood alone. Her gaze fell upon the old bakery, where she and Samuel had once shared warm bread rolls on crisp afternoons. It had changed ownership 3 times since. The storefront windows were different. The familiar aroma had vanished. She did not weep. She simply turned back towards Ruth's abode, her eyes scanning the sky. The stars overhead, soft and unfamiliar, seemed to belong to a different firmament. The following morning she prepared for her departure early. Ruth attempted to dissuade her, but Clara offered a gentle smile. "My family awaits." Upon her return, the girls had fashioned a welcoming banner. "Welcome home, Mamma," it read, rendered in paint and adorned with ribbons strung between 2 trees. Rosie had added hearts. Hannah had endeavored to sketch chickens. Bethany had meticulously glued dried flowers to the edges. Matthew stood beneath it, hat in hand, his expression one of profound disbelief that she had indeed returned. "I've brought cookies," Clara announced, holding up a tin. "I've brought tears," he responded, drawing her into a warm embrace. Later that evening, after the girls had retired to bed, Clara sat beside him on the porch and inquired, "Did you ever imagine we would reach this point?" Matthew remained silent for a considerable moment. Then he finally spoke. "Every single day I believed it would all unravel." A smile graced her lips. "It didn't. No, it didn't." Autumn arrived with gentle grace. The trees blazed in shades of gold. The mornings were crisp and invigorating. Clara found herself humming as she worked, melodies both old and new. The girls commenced their schooling, and each morning transformed into a practiced ballet of locating socks, preparing breakfast, braiding hair, and retrieving forgotten pencils. One evening, after supper, Bethany presented a book, requesting Clara to read aloud. The other girls nestled around her, one tucked beneath each arm, while Matthew settled into the rocking chair, engrossed in carving a new spoon. The narrative unfolded the tale of a resilient fox who painstakingly constructed a dwelling from nothing piece by piece, gathering companions along the way. Midway through the story, Rosie looked up and declared, "That's us." Clara paused, her voice questioning. "What do you mean, my darling?" "You are the fox," Rosie explained, "and Papa is the steadfast rock, and we are the home." Matthew looked up from his carving, his eyes soft with emotion. Clara smiled, drew the girls closer, and concluded the story. The years flowed onward. Winters were marked by biting cold, but filled with abundant laughter. Summers were a whirlwind of preserving, harvesting berries, and baking birthday cakes. The girls grew tall. Bethany composed eloquent poems. Hannah meticulously sketched birds. Rosie delighted everyone with her uncanny imitations of the rooster. The younger girls followed their elder sisters like a flock of ducklings, and all of them addressed Clara as Mama, as if no other maternal designation had ever existed. She never once corrected them, not even when Bethany, at 18 years old, whispered, "You rescued us." Not even when Hannah inquired, "Do you think my biological mother would be proud of me?" Clara responded, yes, she would be, and also because deep within, Clara had seamlessly integrated into both roles, the mother who gave them birth and the one who had steadfastly supported them through all that followed. One chilly autumn evening, long after the girls had gone to sleep, Clara and Matthew sat companionably by the warmth of the fire. He offered each of them a generous portion of apple beverage, and they observed the hypnotic dance of the fire's tendrils. "Do you reckon we'll manage all right?" she inquired, not out of uncertainty, but because voicing the thought often brought a sense of reassurance. Matthew reached out, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I absolutely know we will." There was no grand spectacle, no sudden celestial sign, no profound unveiling of truth, merely a comforting, consistent warmth and a profound sense of tranquility. They remained there for an extended period, long after the flames had diminished to embers, absorbing the familiar auditory tapestry of their dwelling, the gentle respiration of their 6 young daughters slumbering above, the persistent murmur of the wind caressing the panes, the comforting symphony of a dwelling that had blossomed into a true family unit. And when Matthew eventually rose, extending his hand to assist Clara from her seat, she experienced a profound sense of resolution, as if every facet of their shared odyssey had at last found its rightful place, like the final pieces of a completed jigsaw puzzle. Many years subsequently, an acquaintance of the local law enforcement official paid a visit, inquiring about accommodations for a young relative residing in the community. This individual, a recent arrival, was apprehensive, bereft of immediate family, and in search of employment. She possessed no close relations. Clara's response was immediate and unequivocal. "We invariably have space for an additional soul," she declared, her gaze reflecting a sentiment far surpassing mere benevolence, a depth akin to cherished recollection. The young lady's appellation was Elsie. She wept throughout the initial night of her sojourn and again on the subsequent evening. However, by the 3rd night, Rosie had regaled her with a humorous anecdote. Bethany graciously presented her with a woolen neck warmer, and Matthew thoughtfully constructed a modest writing surface for her adjacent to the window. Clara tenderly tucked her in, bestowed a kiss upon her brow, and murmured with genuine conviction, "You have found your haven now, and your place is here. This abode expands, and our affection deepens." And much later, when Clara's hair had transformed into a cascade of silver strands, and the front veranda groaned under the weight of new inhabitants, a small inscribed plate was affixed above the entrance. It bore the inscription, "Where spirits are healed and kinships are reborn." And indeed, that was precisely the essence of this cherished residence.